The Innovation Show is brought to you by Kyndryl. Kyndryl runs and reimagines technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find out more about Kyndryl at kyndryl.com. Marshall McLuhan once wrote, "We look at the present through a rear-view mirror. We march backwards into the future." Mark Twain purportedly said, "History does not repeat, but it often rhymes." The challenge for leaders is not in recognizing the rhyme afterwards, but in hearing it while it's still faint. That is why today's episode, amidst all the others within the resource allocation process, is so relevant. Up until now in the book, From Resource Allocation to Strategy, there are several approaches that businesses employ when dealing with disruptive technology. One, bottom-up processes like engineers following established rules, like revenue per square inch at Intel, which redirected the company's strategy from DRAM to semiconductor chips. Two, customer capture of the resource allocation process, where your top customers heavily influence your strategy with sustaining innovations. Three, in some cases, we have CEO or top-down intervention redirecting resource allocation, as we'll see in today's episode. And four, further examples include setting up a separate unit and a separate context, which protects that unit from capital market metrics of success and indeed existing customer influences on the resource allocation process. Today's guest argues that diversified corporations create advantage not by sharing resources across divisions, but by strategic integration, recombining assets from multiple divisions to pursue new opportunities. Because divisional incentives, risk, and uncertainty block this, top-down intervention, often the CEO, is absolutely essential. He covered a case study of BCE and examined decisions about major capital expenditures in a turbulent environment. He showed how a real options approach to resource allocation preserved BCE's flexibility to exploit future strategic integration opportunities without overinvesting. It is a pleasure to welcome back author of all these books behind me, The Three Rules, The Strategy Paradox, Innovator's Solution with Clayton Christensen, and indeed The Innovator's Manifesto. And of course, today's focus, his friend, his mentor, Joe Bauer, and the Resource Allocation to Strategy book that we've been covering on the show. It's a pleasure to welcome back Michael Raynor. Welcome to the show.
It's great to be here.
It's been a long time. Last time we spoke was we were talking about another one of your mentors, which was your co-author, Clay Christensen. But I thought we'd share a little bit about your relationship with Joe, seeing as we're here to recognize and celebrate his contribution to the strategy literature.
Joe was the chair of my thesis student. So I started the DOCO program, the DVA program at the HBS in, I'll say, late last century. Back in the late 90s. And I sat at my little cubicle just up the hall from Joe's office, and he was characteristically supportive and helpful, and I'm very happy to say, in my own small way, I'm part of that legacy.
It was interesting. We were talking to him over the time, and Clark Gilbert was saying, for example, he helped create so many people who were brilliant contributors to the strategy literature, which you have come to become with those books behind me as well. But you were so lucky to be chosen by him. He was saying that those people who were chosen, those people who were in the book, have gone on to be very well recognized in strategic work.
I think that's true. And as I reflect on it, maybe it was evil genius on Joe's part. I don't know, but I never got the impression that there was any pressure or effort or need to stick handle or cow shoot his DOCO students or the people he worked with into a particular approach. I think that, and that's probably born on the fact that even then, 30 years ago, Joe was already well established and wasn't in any hurry to somehow hijack or co-opt other people to build his legacy. He wanted to see people do work that they wanted to do and that they would find rewarding. And again, I can tell you what it felt like to me, right? Is that if you found your way into that tradition, then that was not something that he was actively promoting. But if you landed there, he was more than happy to support you and to try and help you make as meaningful contribution as you could.
One of the things he said was that he picked people who were willing to do the work and willing to go after something. And I thought maybe we'll share yours because you went after specific areas that you could shine with your thesis and actually go and do the work and understand these companies. Let's share a little bit about that because it'll help us set up today's episode.
I decided to go pursue doctoral studies with a particular area in mind. So when I got started in consulting and finished business school in the early 90s, that's when the dawn of the internet and kind of convergence 1.0. It's the whole notion is that phone company and cable companies were all converging in the same space from very different starting points. The future that we had now was the future we envisioned then that we thought we would have by 2003, but didn't show up until about 6 months ago, right? Where in keeping with the notion that we underestimate change in the long run, but overestimated in the short run. And so I was keen to get my arms around the relatively tactical question of how the media, entertainment, public communications space was all becoming one big hairball. And then, like any good doctoral program, I suppose, is supposed to do, I was set back, tried to get grounded as well as I could in what's already known about strategy and organization. And then came to see that same problem as a specific instance of a larger phenomenon. So in the end, I ended up looking at exactly the companies I hoped to look at. DCE, big diversified Canadian telecoms company, a much bigger deal 30 years ago than it is today. But then looked at them through that lens and develop what I hope is a set of tools that shed light on a much broader range of problems that are relevant even today.
You say in the chapter at the start, it's beyond the scope of that chapter to rehearse the RAP model in its entirety. But I'd love you to give us your definition of it, or at least your definition as it came to light for BCE, because it's really useful to see the different lenses and the different descriptions of RAP.
Yeah, well, I mean, the book that you're focusing on is, and you will mention this in other discussions, I'm sure, right? So it's a synthesis of the number of threads of research that have emanated from or converged upon Bauer's reverse allocation process model. And that model, as I think of it, essentially describes how strategies actually formulated over time. So this goes back to the mid 60s when Joe did this work. What I find amazing is that it seems to me to be a fully accurate description of how it happens even today. We don't have to tear it up and start over. It's only the rhetoric that tells us the world is completely different. And so it's a description of how companies generate and approve project level initiatives, right? Your strategy is what you spend your money. And so the RAP model describes how companies spend their money on some things and not others. And to mind you, that's going to be the essence of good strategy, right? You've heard people say strategy is what we don't do, right? Being focused means being clear about what doesn't happen. And what the RAP model describes is how in well-functioning companies, they systematically don't do the things that aren't consistent with their strategy, right? The mechanisms of the resource allocation process are not a bug, it's a feature. Okay. It's how companies stay focused on the markets they hope to serve. But then the subsequent work is about two things, I think. One is how do companies change strategy when they need to? And how do they innovate when they need to? And that's different, right? Because organizations necessarily put in place constraints. That's what the RAP model is. But if it says that you've got corporate context, you've got product market context and customer, all these things that put you in a box, but that's not a bad thing. you put in place those constraints so that the organization doesn't have buck feet or just shoot anything that moves, because that's its own form of power. Okay? So management is about placing constraints on the opportunities that people pursue, because without them, the organization would just dissipate. But the problem with constraints is sometimes you need to break them. And so the research in resource allocation, the quality, I think describes two things. It says sometimes those constraints do in fact prove pathological. And in two ways. One is they may actually prevent you from, for example, getting out of the businesses that are no. It prevents you from seeing threats to your existing business. And it prevents you from pursuing opportunities that you otherwise should. And so the question becomes, what kinds of overrides, what kinds of compensating mechanisms can you put in place? And this is a part that is still taking shape in my own head, is how systematic can you be about that, right? Is there a process for changing? Is there a meta process? There's the resource allocation process, and then there's the process for changing your resource allocation. We'll dispense with the third order, the third order change process for now. But that's, I suppose that's how I see the arc of that war.
And one of the things, and this will tee us up for when we talk about BCE, which is the core case study of this chapter, is managers chase local wins that make them look good, and not just to the company, but actually to their peers, even if it means missing bigger wins for the company, because they're so far removed, because of those because of that compartmentalization that's happened in the company, that they're in charge of that compartment and not the overall container.
Yeah, and that's something you can fix, right? I mean, it's easy to hear what you just described. I think is correct, and conclude that somehow it's a self-serving pathology of small-minded entity. I don't think that's true. I think that people respond to the incentives that are put in place. They cannot be expected to understand or know what all the larger order trade-offs and objectives are. I mean, if that could actually work, then the only thing you need to do is give everybody stock options and job done. Right? But that doesn't work that way. The world's too complicated. So we give people specific objectives that are tailored to the decision rights that they have been allocated, that are appropriate to the magnitude and scope of opportunities that they can see. They have a budget limit. They can spend up to X million of dollars without approval. They have to deliver a given return on investment. They have certain metrics beyond just ROI, things like gross margin. And you do all of that because those are things you can actually see. The connection between what you do and share price, I mean, good luck with that. And the problem, the unavoidable problem, is that every set of incentives that you specify is always going to be underspecified. You can't fix that. And so you put in place the best system you've got, and the art of management is constantly tinkering with the incentive structures and the organizations. That's why people go through reorgs. So you figure about reporting structures, and you change those things to adapt the constraints to what you're actually trying to accomplish as a company. That's hard, right? But then the higher order problem is what happens when you simply can't tinker the margins, and it requires a much more directed and significant reconfiguration of those constraints, right? So that the risk of going on a little too long here, if you look at disruptive innovation, right? You've got a situation where Clay's prescription is, look, I need a whole new organizational fit, right? I need to fit the constraints to the new opportunity and context. I can't do that within this existing set of structures. Because by the way, this existing company has got its own things to do that are still worth doing. And it can't be all blue and all red at the same time. Right? So that's how I think about that hierarchy of changing versus fundamentally reshaping, remaking the strengths that drive.
We'll share a little bit about that when we talk about Emergis, which was this emerging element of BCE. But just to, again, give the front loading of some of the lenses through which to see this episode, you share that there's at least two types of risk that are leaders are confronted with, or managers are confronted with. The first is execution risk. And then secondly, in at least some circumstance, you say which resources should be recombined and in what ways and when. And all that can be subject to real uncertainty. And those two real risks confronting managers freeze them or make them decide not to actually back or put up resources towards an opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I refer to it as strategic risk or strategic uncertainty, right? So in the case of the BC Maine Telecom company, when they were actually years ago, they were faced with a reconfiguration of the landscape. They had been for a long time in a regulated land telecom company, and suddenly they were faced with satellite TV and the need to have content and then mobile telephony and internet access, and so the issue was no longer how do we compete as a telco, but what is the industry that we're in? And so I refer to that as strategic uncertainty. And the problem was that a company that had a fairly finely tuned set of resource allocation processes were unfortunately finely tuned for an industry that was, I'll say, dissolving. But what you need to go do instead was unclear. And so we had the Intel example with Bergelman and the shift, as you mentioned in your opening comments, the shift from memory to processors. What they needed to be is already evident because for crying out loud, processors were 50% of their revenue when they finally decided, hey, you know what, maybe we should be a processor. That's its own kind of problem, but it's very different than the problem of we look at the landline telephone business and think, this has got a best before day look, but we don't know what we need to transform into, right? We haven't already become a 50% some other kind of company. And now what we need to do is formalize what we've already done and do it on purpose instead of by accident. No, different problem with fire. That's what I'll call strategic uncertainty, as opposed to navigating a strategic change.
One of the things that I found really useful was you compare the risks that a divisional manager might face versus the opportunities from a leader because they can see from an overall perspective. And you say, for example, managers will skip opportunities because they lack information, they lack motivation, they see higher risks, and they face strategic uncertainty. And in short, they have weak incentives, high personal risk, and uncertain payoff, which all discourage them. But from the perspective of the RAP framework, CEOs or leaders from a high level have huge opportunities because of the way they see things. I'd love you to just juxtapose those two views and see why sometimes it takes the CEO or the leader stepping in to make these decisions just to override any kind of divisional barriers.
I can go ahead and you've actually laid it out really completely already, right? Which is that it's the essence of organization is differentiation and integration, right? I mean, we've got a lot of stuff to do. We've got a lot of different decisions to make. So in order to create coherent collective action, we have to divide up the labor, right? But then we have to make sure that everybody doing their piece in a way that knits back together to achieve our collective end, right? So you differentiate by creating different functions, different layered in the hierarchy, and different incentives to go with each, right? So everybody knows what to focus on. So you give guess what? You give the sales force a sales target, shopping, right? You give the operations department a productivity target. There's no surprise there. But then how do you make sure that those now differentiated efforts are all rowing in the same direction? And that's where the constraints come, right? So you will say things like, yes, you have a sales target subject to a profitability constraint. Yes, you have a production target subject to a cost constraint. And that's the art of management. Like, so when you have middle managers that are looking at over a specific time horizon, because by the way, that's what you gave, certain things will look like a bad idea that from a different perspective look like a good idea. And that's okay. But not everybody has to agree, provided it's clear who gets to make the fall. And so you can have senior management kind of hurling thunderbolts from Mount Olympus saying, hey, wait a minute, we need to be in the IT consulting business. We need to be in the satellite TV business. That's not something anybody in the phone business is going to propose. That's okay. You want folks who are in the phone business to run the phone business. And so they make those portfolio level decisions because they've got a different set of constraints and incentives, and that's okay.
I'd love if you gave us a bit of the context of the time. The way I started off today's episode is to go, don't look at this as a history lesson. Look at it as a template for the exact same pattern that you're seeing today with any industry, but maybe the technologies have changed or the regulation have changed. And I loved how you phrased this. You said that at the time, telcos were caught between Scylla and Charybdis of technology and regulatory uncertainty. So they were in this rock and a hard place. That was the kind of context. But maybe you'd share some of the technological changes that were happening at the time, some of the trends that they were seeing, and some of the stuff they got wrong.
Tactically, right? This was when the home-based internet was relatively new. Most people were still on dial-up. But I mean, that's a technology that's several layers dead now. Making dial-up phone, for instance, and it was clear that that was not going to be the way of the future, right? Everybody understood that more bandwidth was the thing that was going to drive adoption and be a pretty thoroughgoing change. But the question is, how do you get? We had the cable companies with their coax infrastructure that was apparently broader bandwidth, but because it was a network infrastructure, it was subject to congestion. Then you had the phone companies with their narrower bandwidth, but because it switched, you had basically what amounted to a dedicated line. So there was fundamental trade-offs between the two existing infrastructure, and they each were thinking about how they migrated to a technological platform that broke that trade-off, that gave people both bandwidth and no congestion. And what that would look like for both, it became fiber optics, and not many people really knew that. But we're competing with investment requirements measured in the billions of dollars back then in the Canadian market. Plus, oh, and by the way, you're worried about wireless technology and video distribution and the rise of oh my God. So it was this full portfolio of technologies that they get wrestled. And that's what made it such a chaff. You kind of knew what the outlines of the end state it would look like, but how you got from here to there and how fast and at what cost. Getting to that end state requires surviving every intermediate state along the way. That's the challenge.
All right, I'm going to set you up maybe to tell us a bit about BCE and the challenges they faced. I'll give the history piece to save you the hassle here. So I'm quoting from the book here. The largest telco service provider in Canada at the time was BCE, began as Bell Telephone Company of Canada, formed by an act of Canadian Parliament in 1880. The company's first wave of diversification began over a century later in 1983, when then CEO Jean de Grandpré restructured the company, creating Bell Canada Enterprises, or BCE, a holding company, so that management could pursue growth opportunities outside the boundaries defined by the original act. Only Bell Canada, the division responsible for legacy phone company operations, continued to be bound by those obligations. Between 1983 and 1990, BC undertook a series of initiatives that turned out to be a failed exercise in unrelated diversification. So maybe I'll hand you the baton at that stage to tell us how did it unfold, and then we'll compare that to a second period of diversification in 1995.
Right. So, if you will, the natural experiment there was that BCE was stuck in a low growth regulated business, right? So, the landline telephony services in Canada have reached a point where you're basically going to grow you'll have new lines at the rate of population growth, and you'll be allowed to you can charge for whatever the regulator says you can, right? So you're a pawn, right? You are a public utility. No, that's not an insult, but it's just a description. And the management thought, wait a minute, we want to be a growth company. That's first saying the obvious. That's our higher order economic model. That's what we're built on. And the whole point is to grow and increase profits and profitability. So if you're in a regulated utility business, you can't do that. So the Grand Prix's effort was to put put Bell Canada in a box, and that would give the company the opportunity to raise capital separately to go pursue growth opportunities elsewhere. So they did things like telecommunications, consulting, and infrastructure in Saudi Arabia and a couple of other places. So countries that were building out their own phone infrastructure that thought, well, we've done that before. Why don't we help other countries do that as well? And so they got into a number of other businesses, real estate, financial services, a bunch of other things. And what they found out is what a lot of companies tend to find out is that if you go and decide that you are going to get into a business where there are a lot of other well-established companies whose bread and butter depends critically on defending that ground, it's probably not going to be very well. Because what is for you a growth opportunity is to them their lunch, right? And so, especially in things like financial services in Canada, you can pick a fight with the Royal Bank of Canada and the Canadian Federal Bank of Commerce and the Bank of Nova Scotia in front. Those folks have been around longer than you have in their business. You'll do no better in banking than they do in telecoms, sweetheart. And that's what so they broke their pick in a way that a lot of companies end up breaking their pick. They had no particular competitive advantage, no particular core resource that they could leverage, no particular skill that they nothing. And so, perhaps not surprisingly, that turned out poor. That's different, I think, fundamentally, different in kind on degree from the diversification that they started pursuing in the 90s. Because there, they were faced with undefined and wide open spaces. There were no incumbents. It was a relatively new space that there were other companies that also wanted to compete for this new land. But there was nobody really established. It's almost as though the Hawaiian Islands suddenly emerged in the middle of the Pacific, and it's a bit of a land grab for this new space. Nobody's really too sure how you compete for it. What you do know, you can't compete for it with what you got up your further right. It's so the diversification that they pursued was driven by a desire to assemble the function of resources that they might need.
You said there was two important differences between this diversification initiative and the Grand Prize. First was that although each of the investments was operationally separate from the core telephony business, the potential for meaningful synergies at some point in the future featured prominently in the company's stated strategy. And second, each investment took the form of a partial ownership stake rather than outright acquisition. They were vastly different ways of seeing these bets that they made, as well as what you said, putting it on emerging opportunities.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And sometimes you do the right thing for the wrong reason. Yeah, which is that they understood if we're going to compete in broadband infrastructure and the content space, we can't do that with what we have in the armory right now. So they mean to acquire the assets that could potentially be recombined. When and in what way, we're not sure. Okay, fair enough. So to your point, they then went out and many of these investments were partial equity stakes. As a practical matter at the time, it was largely a function of the fact that they just didn't have a big enough bank account to go buy these things out with. But what that meant is that they actually were able to be much more capital efficient and to calibrate their investment to the level of certainty they had with respect to the value of an asset and its synergy value in the long run. And even from a financial theory perspective, I think that works. And what it means is that if I buy a partial equity stake in a mobile telephony company, this is what they do on BC Mobile, then they don't have to lay out all the cash up front. They're not faced with all the risk associated with having benefit. And it could turn out that integrating mobility with handling services does in fact create significant synergy value. Then they will have a differential value from which to bid for the outstanding equity. And so they're no longer just stuck with a winner's curse overpaying for an asset because they have no particular advantage. It's actually literally worth more to them than it is to anybody else. So they can afford to buy out, to give the other equity holders their reserve price and still have economic profit to capture for themselves.
I love how you say this idea of real options, but also that they can easily turn off an investment because they're seeing the inside view because they have a board position, for example.
Yeah, they have an inside view, and they also have an inside view of the assets that they're looking to combine it with. Right? So they have the requisite decision rights to integrate, to exercise the auction, if you will. Mhm. And when that auction is in the money, again, to repeat myself, it's more valuable to them than it is to anybody else. And so in exercising the option, they will not be forced to give away all of the upside. They can exceed the other equity holders' reserve price and still have access to themselves.
You inform us in this chapter. There's a information asymmetry here that favors the person who's putting the option in. But let's bring it to life, because you bring it to life with four great examples in here. The first is the wireless integration, and I'll tee you up again. You wrote that in 1984, BCE Mobile, or just Mobile, was launched as a part of BCE's first diversification push and was a wholly owned subsidiary. Given the novelty of wireless communications at the time, this is important to cast yourself back there. Entering the wireless telephony industry via acquisition was not feasible, and so the creation of this division is an example of organic growth. I'd love you to pick us up from there and bring us through this mini case study within the bigger chapter.
Yeah, sure. So then came to distinguish ultimately between growth option and strategic option. And so you can look at BC Mobile, the mobile collecting business initially is just a growth option. But the kid business, because we think there's a growth opportunity there. We believe two things. First of all, back to my Hawaii Islands analogy, it's relatively new technology. So it's not as though there's some entrenched incumbent that we're going to have to displace. This is not BCD Enterprises getting in financial services in 1984. This is wide open spaces in the mobile telephony business. Second, the risk of stating the obvious, it's the mobile telephony business. So they probably know a thing or two about what it means to put up a telephony network, even if so. To the extent that the technologies are new, they're new to everybody. To the extent that technologies have any similarities or anything you can leverage with the existing telephony networks, BCE has a privileged position. Mhm. So perfectly reasonable business to get into. I don't think anybody sees that as a particularly controversial point. What emerged was the notion that, hey, wait a minute, this actually could have important strategic synergies with other forms of telecommunication services. Once the internet comes along, people immediately see, well, you can get the internet on your laptop. Why can't you get the internet on your phone? We don't know how to do it yet, but it's pretty easy to see that that's certainly a possibility, right? Hence the need for an option. Then they ran into a situation there, just capital constraints, like building out the network, being a successful mobile telephony company required a bunch of capital, and it made sense to spin that off in order to compete successfully as a mobile telephony. But you hang on to enough of the equity that you still have the option for subsequent integration when and as that becomes the right thing to do. And so, as I mentioned a moment ago, right, they do the right thing for the wrong reason. They split it off because they had to. And given their brothers, they would have rather not. But they had no choice. But then they had foresight to say, well, given that this is what we have to do, we still see the future potential. And so we want to make sure to preserve that option value. And so we'll do so in the following.
You mentioned Clay, and again, as a reminder, Michael co-authored the Innovator solution with Clay as well. But the idea of measuring these different entities differently because they have different cost structures. So you say here, and again with the caveat here that the technology and market convergence has rapidly eroded since Michael wrote this. But you said in the ensuing decade, which was 1987 to 1997, the two companies, Bell and Mobile, operated entirely independently of each other, and with good reason, because the wireless and wireline businesses had different technological infrastructures, cost models, and market and competitive dynamics, and were in different places in their respective life cycles. I thought that was a key line and is agnostic to any industry, because if you're investing in the Hawaiian Islands that have just appeared versus the mainland, they're going to be very, very different. And particularly the revenue streams and the metrics of success are going to be very different. This is a bigger lesson, I suppose, beyond this chapter, but I'd love you to share your view on it.
speaks to each organization's respective resource allocation process. Right? You'd want them to have very different corporate contexts. You want them to have a very different strategic context. You want them to have a different initiation phase, or you want them to pursue different plans because they had different strategy. The constraints that you impose upon them are very different for reasons we just discussed. My point around strategic flexibility is that there comes a point where they become complementary assets and you need to integrate those constraints in those contexts in order to pursue the new opportunity. And you cannot build a system that does two completely different things at the same time, right? So you have a system that's exploiting, you have the system that's exploring, if you will. And at some point you need to flip from one to the other, right? So good old fashioned variation, selection, retention, and creating those options is how you create the variation. And the selection processes within companies, that's the resource allocation process. And the selection process around how you actually integrate them, well, that sits up at the corporate level, again, for reasons we've discussed, and we have to separate those decision rights.
One of the challenges then later on that you may have grown them separately, but then comes a point where you need to strategically integrate them. And you say some of the challenges here were, for example, one of the first opportunities for synergy was in the retail distribution business. I'd love you to take us through this, both what happened, but also the challenges that happened mainly at a divisional level.
Where I ended up going with the options thinking is that you have to keep these divisions on a leash, right? So it's one thing to say, let them go off and maximize their growth and profitability. If you really do want to be able to stitch them back together at some point, it's possible to diverge too much, right? If you think about, I don't know, I'm stuck in an evolutionary metaphor. If you think about allopatric speciation, right? Two species are separated by space and they evolve along different trajectories. And then if members of those two different subspecies meet up again, well, they can't reproduce anymore. Right? They go off in different directions for too long. So you have to kind of keep them close enough that you can, in fact, put them back together. And I think retail distribution case reveals what happens when the differences are simply too great. People who come in to buy a mobile phone versus people that have complaints about their landline voicemail service. Again, these are technologies that some people have never even listened to this, may never experience. They are simply so different that on its face, it looks like, oh, let's just leverage the sales force. But then it turns out in reality that that's not the option you buy. That option is not actually in the money.
You were talking about options, so taking options or investing in certain companies. But sometimes, and I'm sure this rings true for so many people listening to the show, maybe who are involved in this, that decision making becomes very, very difficult because decisions have to be made twice often by each organization's management team or their board of directors. And to get around this, BCE bought back its outstanding equity in mobile, for example, for 1.6 billion Canadian dollars, a 31% premium to BCE's mobile market price only 1 month prior to the deal. And this was to accelerate decision making, that they felt it was worth that margin to speed up that decision making.
Yeah, so they gave themselves the governance rights. So they purchased the governance rights from the existing equity holders. And in addition, right, very often you have to override the existing incentive structures for managers as well, right? So you can buy it, the other shareholders, you can pay them their reserve price. And that, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, the argument is, yes, you can give them their 30% premium, but it's worth some material amount more than that to you because of the synergies that you can capture that would otherwise be unavailable. So that's what makes it a good deal for your share. In addition, right, you're going to have constraint systems in place for the folks who are operating these businesses, and you may not actually want to change all of those incentive structures in order to get the organization to do what you want it to do. Instead, it becomes a one-time override to say, no. We want this to happen. I will insulate you from the impact that it would have on your established KPIs and your compensation, right? Because I want this to happen, but I don't want all the misery that comes with having to try and figure out how to completely reconfigure every aspect of the incentive structure. That's crazy. The incentive structure actually works pretty well, right? I just need to smash these things together for now. And for the next 6 months, I want you to play according to these rules, and they'll go back to right. And so it's those individual overrides just to rearrange the furniture, and then let everybody go back to do jobs.
These are all things that are easy to look in through the rearview mirror. That's the reason I wanted to share them. And you said also that removing the need to quantify the benefits of integration for minority shareholders was only part of the benefit, however. Within the Bell and Mobility organization was also considerable resistance from relatively senior management to even preliminary efforts to pursue strategic integration rather than merely synergies. You give a great example here. Simply One was a product launched in 1999 that gave residents and customers a single phone number that forwarded incoming calls to multiple devices until either the subscriber answers or all previously identified numbers have been tried, in which case the caller can leave a message. The drive for Simply One, you say, came from Bell, not from Bell Mobility. And Bell Mobility viewed it as a threat. As far as they were concerned, they owned the mobile business. When Bell started selling a service that included mobility, Bell was sort of encroaching on their turf and taking something away. This, Michael, this is in every company in all over the world, no matter what size, is when somebody builds something that could be some type of fighter brand or emerging technology, and then the big brother or the existing incumbent wants to subsume it or package it or bundle it. There's always that resistance. I'd love you to share your views on it.
Yeah, I think let's start with the specifics in on Stimuli One, because again, 20 plus, 25, more than 30 years later, and look, gosh, it could stay well. That's not the problem anymore, because really anybody only ever has one mobile number. The notion that you have multiple numbers and then to manage the complexity of that is bizarre to us now. But back then it was a real issue. Right? And so the landline business was in a situation where people had a whole number that they actually used. People had an office landline they actually used. And then they had a mobile number, but they actually used. And so it's not crazy to have three different, and then a fax, oh, and by the way. So people had three different phone numbers that they may want people to be able to reach them. And that was a real hassle. And the landline business thought, well, if we can make the complexity of having multiple numbers go away, people will actually keep their multiple numbers, right? If the complexity is really burdensome, then people will start shedding numbers, and they're not going to get rid of their mobile number. Right? So if I can hide that complexity, they'll keep their home number, they'll keep their office number, because whichever number gets called, it will fund. And so that was a solution to a problem that the customers had that actually would have belonged the franchise of the wireline business. So terrific. And you can see why the mobility business would look at that and go, whoa, 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 time out. Right? That doesn't work for you. And that actually is going to limit my growth. And so that's where the corporate office steps in and says, all right, we have to make a bet.
So leadership decided to take an option and go, look, we're gonna go with it.
So faced with this conflict between mobility and the landline business, or is how integrated on both services to be, it falls to senior management to make a one-time ad hoc decision on what's the right way to proceed. You can't build an entire set of processes and structures and systems to solve what are essentially non-repeated decisions, right? You need processes for things you do repeatedly, not the things that are almost by definition unique opportunities that are difficult to predict and will almost certainly never repeat. And so that's where you have kind of that, I'll call that leadership. That's where you have the top-down, ad hoc, limited scope, limited duration interventions, as I said before, to rearrange the furniture and then let everybody go back to doing what they're doing.
I love how you put it. You say top-down pressure made integration possible. Bottom up alone would have killed it. And that happens in so many companies where the top don't even know that bottom up killed the idea that never emerged to the top. We see this all the time where like my people aren't innovative and you kind of go, maybe they are, but it's getting stuck at this immiscible layer in the middle.
Well, but so that's a really good point. So innovative, but within what parameters, right? And so the argument is that probably plenty innovative within the parameters that the organization has set for them. And P.S., that's you, senior management. You have set those parameters. So they're kind of doing what you pay them to do. You shouldn't be surprised. And I think it's a mistake to think that somehow, and so what I need to do is I need to start changing all of my incentive structures in order to, no, because if you do that, they won't do the things they're doing now for keeping points, right? This is my particular take. The way I've come to internalize and think about a very evergreen problem that many people have tackled in different language in different ways. But I think the tradition that grew up around Bauer and the resource allocation process is a particularly powerful and practical and granular way of thinking about that challenge. So yes, it's about exploitation and exploration. What the resource allocation process model describes is how organizations actually exploit given the strategic context. It talks about what needs to, how in fact you go about exploring. Where do you create the variation in the projects and businesses that you hope to pursue? How do you choose which of them to invest in over time? And how does that manifest in either reinforcing or changing a company's side?
That's one of the things I picked up when you talked about the Grand Prix first excursion and the second excursion was the second one was dictated by strategic imperatives or strategic direction in some way. At least people knew where they were going to play.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the first efforts were attempts purely to drive growth. And when that's all you're trying to do, there's basically no, curiously enough, there's no constraint on what you could go get into. I mean, why not get into consumer products or food or anything's on the table? Why look at real estate, financial services? And I mean, sure, look at those, but why not? Nothing's off the table. And it becomes really tricky because all of a sudden, anything that looks like it meets your financial hurdles is going to look like it's a good idea. And now all of a sudden, senior management consists of deciding whether it's settling bigger than 4. So that's trivia. And when that's all you're working on, it's not a surprise that it doesn't go up. And the second round of diversification was driven by strategic priorities where there were clear reasons to be in or out of specific opportunities. And the reason you don't get into consumer products, consumables, or foodstuffs is because that's got nothing to do with the convergence threats that you're facing. Right? That's if you're making lunch meat, that's not going to help you fend off the cable companies who are coming after your mail business, right? So they had a reason to be in one place versus another. Certain very specific uncertainties they were trying to hit.
It reminds me always my first real job was digital in a media company, and they were always going, "What's the digital strategy?" And I go, "What's the strategy first?" Then I'll give you the digital strategy. And we're seeing this today with AI. What's the AI strategy? You go, well, what's the strategy?
That's an excellent point. Yeah. I mean, it's for you. I don't know if this is where you want to take a conversation next, but you mentioned at the outset that these things are not history lessons. And case studies are interesting. Now that I'm a prophet highly dealing with this firsthand, cases start out as timely and current, then they become instructive and seasoned, then they become dated and musty, and then they become iconic and classic. Right? Then it's about what they've been like. And then after that, they just become history-less. So nobody really does case studies on general knowledge. Pretty soon, studying GE under Jack Welch in the 80s will be, that's not sufficiently dated that it feels musty out of date. Give it another 15 years. Classic. It's really, I mentioned this earlier, it's tempting to look at Joe's work from the 60s at National Products, which I think is generally accepted now with Dow Chemical. And so what can that possibly have to tell us? I mean, 1960, are you kidding me? No, I'm not kidding you. It actually does describe how the conflicts work today. The the convergence challenges that I was looking at 30 years ago look an awful lot to me like the same kinds of issues that the titans of today are pressing. So if you look at diversification strategies of the Microsoft, it's awfully relevant of the same kinds of things that meet. The big difference is that the titans of today have basically bottomless financial resources. And so the kinds of things that you would seek are collecting stakes and trying to be conservative with capital. That's not a constraint. Fair. Anything they can really do, they do. They just write big in a chapter and way. But the cast is getting better, right? The imposing the variation, selection processes, and the retention, I think, is largely the same. You keep getting the things. Meta gets into consumer products and their classes, and Google got sold very successfully and ended that. So you see that same diversification and reduced variation, and then saying coalescing around their opportunities as they take shape. And AI starts to look like much the same kind of thing. Faith and uncertainty, faith in the new land grab. People trying things with an eye to how they can stitch together the solutions.
Brilliant. I'm so glad you said that, Michael, because that's the point, I think, of going back is that there's so much valuable stuff. And the thing I've realized is the more modern books are actually just rehashing stuff that's been said before in a more modern way. But if you go back to the sources, when the sources are still there, the value of it is just incredible. You do see the rhymes of history rather than the repetition.
The thing I thought occurred to me there is that the rhetoric is always one of today is unprecedented change, today is massively uncertain in the way that the past never was, and yada yada yada. We paraphrase Elaine Seinfeld. But I don't think that's true. What is true, however, I think, is that the phenomenon that we're studying is in the sweep of human history pretty new. I mean, I don't reread Chandler nearly as often as I would like to. But he's looking at organizations that grew up in the late 19th, early 20th century, and they really were first of a kind. And so we're not even looking at 150 years of history here. But in that first 150 years, we pretty much experienced at a conceptual level all there is to experience. And to the extent that we understand how that works conceptually, right? Well, we know what we need to know. Does that mean there's no more to learn? No, that's not what I'm saying, right? The human body hasn't changed much, but medical science still has a lot to learn. So that's true, right? But the fact that there's more to learn doesn't mean that we need to keep learning the things that we already know. And so my concern, I guess, is that a lot of us out there seems to take pride in not building deliberately and carefully on what is already to be true. In the medical sciences, the physical sciences, you can't show up with a new theory for a grand unified theory of everything that combines quantum mechanics and gravitational physics without accurately accounting for all of the things that we already know. So somebody shows up with a new theory for strategy, like, but wait a minute, that doesn't explain 98% of the things you've already explained. So why do I take this new thing serious? And so that almost religious fervor around not taking past work seriously, I think is really a terrible.
Amen, amen, man. I have to tell you this as well. Like, I actually couldn't have read your books when I first met you. Hadn't built up the knowledge enough. Like, really, I mean this. I've said this to people over the years that if you go back to the early shows, my questions were much more basic and my knowledge was much more basic. But I'm doing this nearly 10 years now, and that knowledge compounds, and it makes you able to have a better conversation and actually understand what the person's saying in the book as well. Because we talked before about a lot of these books are quite academic, and this book is quite academic as well.
And written for Nagin and Nagani, right? It's Oxford University Press, after all. Yeah.
And actually, it's one of the reasons I want to share it because for me, I see this kind of perfect storm of our attention spans are getting less. We're using things like AI to do the struggle work of learning for us or translating stuff or synopsizing it, and it's making the decision what's important or not in those texts, which is just crazy. So I really wanna share this knowledge to people and break it down into simple, biteable chunks that they can understand it, and maybe save them the hassle of reading it and talk to the sources.
Well, I wouldn't know. I could been doing this for 10 years. I'm the 5 years younger. So the well, it's interesting you should mention that. So maybe this is an unwelcome tangent, but now that I and a professor there, I'm actually building some courses, some of which are online in nature. And my explicit intent is to create what I see to be introductory level strategy and innovation courses that are built around this way of looking this way. I think, the resource allocation process model and its expansion that are built around that knowledge. Because I think the introductory strategy courses, I think, start too far back, and they need people where you would have been 10 years ago as a way to, and we don't need to begin there. Like people don't, when people start their chemical engineering degree, they don't start with how to transform lead into gold. Like, they don't start with alchemy. They start with the state of the art. You can introduce the state of the art simply in an introductory way, but you can start people in a place where they can take advantage of the accumulated knowledge they. And I'm finding that, which is part of the reason why, incidentally, I've been going without a lot of this stuff recently. But that's what I plan to do. So my conceit at present is to try and create introductory level materials that start people off at a place that is as close to where we've arrived after many years of thinking about this stuff without having to go through all of that misery, to present to them, right, as a fait accompli, as a proven body of knowledge, right? So that they begin as a foundation at what is for us the summit of everything that we've tried to create over the last several decades. And my belief is that's how we create collective progress. You've kind of forcing them to start all over.
Yeah.
Like, when talk to you about 5 forces and core competence, and not that that stuff's wrong. It's not. But we don't need to start that. We don't need to build up somebody who's new to the field. We don't need to build them up from the same intellectual journey that the entire field is.
You know what it's like, man? You know when you maybe are late to a long-standing series on Netflix. You're kinda going, "Do I have to go back to series 1 to get to series 7?" Like, you're like, "Yeah, you kinda gotta go back." But you're trying to go, "Well, no, it's greenfield. You can jump in wherever." There's a new cast of characters.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I hope I can start, but I don't have a better metaphorical, like, offer than it to go. Hope is that I can bring you in, or to what is for you a plateau, but is for us the summit.
So, Michael, with loads more in there, and I highly recommend people reading the book. It's still out there. It's still available. I'm going to write about it a little bit as well to try and bring it to life. There was a brilliant case study of Bell Emergis, which was emerging tech or emerging opportunities in there. Again, they're all through the lens of resource allocation process, why things didn't work, why some things did work in there. But look through it and realize that it's a template, or it's white label version of exactly what we're all going through. It's hard to read the label when you're inside the jar. If it's your turn, these things happen all the time. They repeat it over and over. Michael, for people who want to find you, you're kind of going to come back and cover these books now that I'm up to the level and I can start at your summit. And I can speak to you at the same level. We're going to cover them in the future. But I know you're doing amazing work at the moment. Apart from your work with Ivy, let's share a little bit about that and where people can find you.
Raynor at ivy.ca. That's my academic email, and also find me at michael@michaelraynor.com. And I'm involved with a kind of startup that is trying to mobilize voluntary climate action on corporates to support the decarbonization of hard to abate commodities. So things like cement and steel and nitrogen-based fertilizers. So in addition to a lot of this conceptual work, I'm actually trying to use the golf clubs to play an actual golf course. And it's been instructive in many ways, not least it's keeping me humble when it comes to how difficult it can be to put this stuff into practice.
And keep the world in golf courses as well at the same time as well.
The world could probably do a fewer golf courses but that's a whole different conversation.
And I'll link to where to find you with that work as well, Michael. And again, as I said, I'm looking forward to coming back and covering your work. Author of Chapter 14 of the Resource Allocation to Strategy book, in tribute to Joe Bauer, Michael Raynor, thank you for joining us.
All right, take care.
Thanks once again to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who run and reimagine the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find out more about Kyndryl and the Kyndryl Institute at kyndryl.com or kyndryl.com/institute.